picture that exact moment at 2 in the morning.
The house is completely quiet.
Your mind suddenly drifts to the future, and you realize your time is finite. You realize that everyone you love will eventually pass away.
That profound awareness generates a deep existential anxiety. Human beings carry a unique and heavy burden. We are the only creatures on Earth fully aware of our own mortality.
For millennia, humanity has constructed massive intellectual and spiritual frameworks to cope with that exact dread. Today, we are exploring our primary text, A Brief History of Thought by Luc Ferry. The author is a celebrated French philosopher and former Minister of Education. We are extracting the most important insights to understand how human beings have tried to cure the fear of death.
In this analysis review, we are not asking yet whether the author is right. We are examining how this book builds its case. We will look at who it speaks to, how it is organized, and what rhetorical choices it makes to persuade its audience.
You are experiencing a unique two-voice conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper book analysis, presented by Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
To begin our analysis, we must establish the author's central thesis. The book argues that all philosophy is, at its root, a response to the human awareness of mortality.
That is a fundamental starting point.
Exactly. The author suggests that philosophy attempts to save us from the fear of death using reason alone. This is the crucial distinction the text makes.
How does the book differentiate that from religion?
According to this argument, religion relies on faith in an external divine authority. Philosophy, however, demands that we generate our own salvation through rational inquiry.
The book illustrates this distinction vividly. We might think of religion, as presented in this text, as a rescue helicopter arriving from above. You put your faith in the pilot to lift you out of danger.
That analogy captures the author's view perfectly.
Philosophy, according to the author, is more like building your own parachute on the way down. You must use only the tools of human reason to weave the fabric and pull the cord yourself.
But before we critique this, let us build the strongest version of the opposing argument.
If I am terrified of dying, and the helicopter guarantees my safety, why would I ever choose the parachute?
The author addresses that directly by identifying the specific rhetorical situation of the book. Luc Ferry is a prominent secular humanist. He recognizes that we live in a post-God world.
The occasion for the book is that modern people still experience intense existential dread.
Yet a large portion of the audience simply cannot force themselves to believe in the rescue helicopter anymore. They have rejected traditional religious structures, therefore they need a new set of tools.
The target audience shapes every aspect of the book's tone. The text is clearly written for curious beginners and students. The author deliberately avoids dense academic jargon.
The tone is measured and historically sweeping, but there is a distinct urgency. The book does not treat philosophy as a sterile classroom exercise. It treats these ideas as a literal matter of life and death.
When you find yourself doom-scrolling late at night worrying about the future, you are experiencing the exact void this book attempts to address.
The primary structural tool the author uses to organize these ideas is highly methodical. The book insists that every serious philosophy contains three inseparable dimensions.
What is the first dimension?
The first is theory, or how we understand the world to be. The second is ethics, or how we coexist with one another.
And the final piece?
The third is salvation, or wisdom. This final dimension addresses how we overcome the fear of our finite nature.
Establishing this three-part framework up front is a brilliant rhetorical move. By defining philosophy this way, the author creates a strict rubric. As readers, we are forced to judge every historical era by these specific criteria.
We are no longer just learning historical facts. We are testing each philosophy to see if it provides a functional parachute.
Having established that rubric, the book structures the history of Western thought chronologically through 5 distinct eras.
We travel through Greek Stoicism, Christianity, modern humanism, postmodernity, and contemporary humanism. The organizational logic here is highly persuasive.
The author presents each era as exposing a fatal flaw in the era that preceded it.
The selection of those eras involves a very specific rhetorical choice. When discussing the ancient Greeks, the book focuses heavily on Stoicism, largely bypassing major figures like Plato and Aristotle.
This choice deserves scrutiny. Stoicism maps perfectly onto the author's 3-part framework. The Stoics viewed the cosmos as a perfectly ordered, rational machine.
Their ethics demanded that humans align their actions with that cosmic order. Their salvation was found in a disciplined detachment, accepting death as a natural return to the universal system.
By focusing on Stoicism, the author makes the narrative of ancient philosophy much cleaner and more organized than the messy reality of the period actually was.
The book details how the Stoic theory of the universe provided comfort. If you believe the universe is fundamentally rational and good, then death must also be a rational and good part of that system.
You lose your fear of death by abandoning your attachment to your individual ego. Let me push back on that concept. If I am terrified of dying, how does obliterating my individual identity bring me comfort? The idea of dissolving back into a cosmic machine sounds incredibly cold.
You have identified the exact flaw the author uses to transition to the next era. The author acknowledges the intellectual power of Stoicism, but points out that the Stoic cosmos is entirely impersonal.
It does not love you.
According to the text, Christianity recognized this flaw and offered a revolutionary alternative. The book admits that Christianity is the most effective doctrine of salvation ever created.
It promises personal immortality, the maintenance of your individual identity, and a permanent reunion with your loved ones.
The author details how Christianity revolutionized ethics as well. It completely rejected the natural hierarchies of the Greek world.
In the Greek framework, the strong, the beautiful, and the aristocratic were closest to the divine.
Christianity inverted that entirely. It declared the meek, the poor, and the weak as blessed, placing all humans as equal before a loving God.
However, the text maintains a strict boundary here. Despite acknowledging the immense power and effectiveness of Christian salvation, the author insists it relies on faith rather than reason.
Because it requires belief in an external revelation, the book categorizes it outside the realm of pure philosophical salvation. To the author, if you are relying on faith, you are no longer doing philosophy.
That categorization paves the way for the humanist pivot. The book describes the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries as a cataclysmic event.
Thinkers like Copernicus and Newton shattered the Christian and Stoic cosmos. The universe was revealed as a cold, infinite, mathematically governed void.
It was no longer a cozy, divinely ordered sphere. Humanity was suddenly entirely alone.
The text shows how modern philosophy was born directly from this isolation. The author introduces René Descartes as the foundational figure of this era.
Descartes used a mechanism called methodological doubt.
The book describes Descartes systematically throwing out every single belief he could possibly doubt, stripping away layers of tradition and assumption until he reached absolute rock bottom.
He found only one undeniable truth. That was the fact that he was thinking. That brings us to his famous conclusion, I think, therefore I am.
The book argues this was a monumental shift. Truth was no longer handed down from the cosmos or from God. It was generated by the individual human mind.
Building on this foundation, the text introduces Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The book highlights Rousseau's concept of perfectibility.
According to this argument, animals follow a biological script. A cat will always act like a cat because it is governed by instinct.
Humans, however, have no script. We possess the freedom to transcend our nature and choose our own path. We are perfectible.
The text then moves to Immanuel Kant, who built upon this freedom to establish a new system of ethics. The book argues Kant established the categorical imperative.
For a listener encountering this term for the first time, how exactly does this abstract ethical rule function? And more importantly, how does it address our fear of death?
To understand Kant's mechanism, we must look at how he defines a moral action. According to the book, Kant argues that ethical action must be entirely disinterested.
If you save a drowning child because you want a financial reward, or even because you want to earn a place in heaven, Kant says that is not a truly moral act.
You are acting out of self-interest, like a merchant making a trade. Kant demands that we act according to a universal duty.
We must ask ourselves if we would want our action to become a universal law for everyone.
Precisely. Now, to connect this to the fear of death, the text suggests that by acting according to this universal reason, humans step outside their mortal biological instincts.
We elevate ourselves above the animal kingdom. We touch something eternal through our capacity for rational morality.
This is Mindful Moments, where we turn powerful books into clear, rational conversations for readers, students, and educators.
As we transition into the postmodern era, the author introduces Friedrich Nietzsche. The book positions Nietzsche as the ultimate critic of everything we just discussed.
The book outlines Nietzsche's method of genealogy. He uses this tool to dismantle the history of Western thought.
We usually use the word genealogy to trace our family tree. I need to clarify how Nietzsche applies this to philosophy.
The text explains that instead of asking if moral values are objectively true, Nietzsche traces the historical family tree of those values. He examines the power dynamics behind them.
As the author explains, Nietzsche argues that traditional morality was actually the revenge of the weak against the strong.
If a group of people is powerless, they cannot defeat a strong warrior physically. Through genealogy, Nietzsche demonstrates how the weak invented a moral system.
That system labeled the warrior's natural strength as evil and their own weakness as a divine virtue.
The book details how Nietzsche uses this concept to accuse both Christianity and Enlightenment humanism of nihilism. This is a fascinating mechanism.
We usually think of a nihilist as someone who believes in nothing. But the book explains that Nietzsche defines nihilism as valuing an imaginary perfect world over the real physical world.
According to this argument, Nietzsche viewed the promise of a heavenly afterlife, or the promise of a future human utopian society, as a massive devaluation of our actual existence.
By constantly hoping for a better world elsewhere, we drain the value from the life we are actually living.
Nietzsche's proposed salvation was the complete affirmation of the present moment, loving fate exactly as it unfolds.
We must observe a critical shift in the book's architecture at this point. As the author discusses postmodernism and the followers of Nietzsche, the tone shifts dramatically.
The author moves from being an objective historian outlining concepts to becoming a passionate, almost angry advocate. The rhetorical temperature rises noticeably.
The author argues that postmodern deconstruction is purely destructive. The book poses a devastating ethical test case.
If we adopt the Nietzschean imperative to unconditionally love fate and accept everything exactly as it is, how do we condemn true evil?
The text uses this specific example of Auschwitz. The author insists that if everything is just an arbitrary power dynamic, and we must affirm reality without appealing to higher ideals, we lose the vocabulary to say that Auschwitz is objectively wrong.
The author argues that pure postmodernism leaves us morally paralyzed, unable to fight against the actual evils of the world.
Because postmodernism completely fails this ethical test in the author's eyes, the book must propose a final rhetorical destination.
The author attempts to build a modern secular salvation based on what he calls horizontal transcendence.
The text uses a helpful analogy from the philosopher Edmund Husserl to explain this concept. Picture a simple matchbox. No matter how you hold it in your hand, you can only see a few sides at once.
You know the other sides exist, but they transcend your immediate vision. Transcendence, in this secular view, is not a supernatural realm floating above the clouds.
It is a structural feature of everyday human experience. When we encounter profound truth, justice, or beauty, we discover something that exceeds our own subjective invention.
It is real, even if we cannot grasp it entirely. The most vital element of this contemporary humanism, according to the book, is love.
The author argues that earthly love provides profound meaning and connection. When we love another person enough to sacrifice our own comfort for them, we step outside our own ego.
We touch a form of transcendence that does not require a supernatural God. This is the author's final attempt to weave the philosophical parachute.
While the narrative arc is incredibly compelling, our analysis requires us to test the structural foundations of the argument. We must look for the blind spots.
The book's architecture relies on several highly deliberate omissions to make the story flow smoothly. The most significant logical limitation is the strict binary the text enforces between reason and faith.
The book consistently frames religion as merely blind trust, entirely separate from rational inquiry. This is a false dichotomy.
It ignores a massive, historically significant tradition of philosophy that merges faith and reason together.
I am reading between the lines here, but by completely omitting thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, who spent their entire lives demonstrating how rational argument and theological belief support one another, the author artificially narrows the playing field.
The book defines philosophy as strictly secular from the outset, which forces a specific conclusion. We also see a fascinating rhetorical concession near the very end of the text.
After spending the entire book building a meticulous case for secular humanism, the author admits that amongst the available doctrines of salvation, nothing can compete with Christianity.
That feels exactly like moving the goalposts.
If the stated purpose of philosophy is to cure the fear of death, and the author admits his secular parachute cannot do this as effectively as the religious rescue helicopter, we must ask if the core argument collapses under its own weight.
The book promises a cure, but ultimately delivers a coping mechanism. These limitations bring us to our analytical conclusion.
A Brief History of Thought is undeniably a masterpiece of accessible structure. The author takes thousands of years of complex intellectual history and organizes it into a profoundly readable, urgent narrative.
However, the omissions we have identified are not accidents. They are deliberate rhetorical choices.
The author intentionally prunes away the messy reality of intellectual history to maintain a clean, highly persuasive narrative arc pointing directly towards secular humanism. If these insights resonate, the full suite of reviews for this book is available.
The summary will give you the complete content map of the 5 eras, while the critique and deep critique will test the ethical and logical foundations we have just identified.
Here are questions to carry into your own reading of this book. Does the author's definition of philosophy as a quest for salvation artificially narrow what philosophy actually is?
Furthermore, if a belief provides the ultimate comfort against the fear of death, does its origin in faith rather than pure reason make it less valuable?
Click the link on screen for the related episodes. We offer essential insights, summary, analysis, critique, or deep critique. Subscribe, share, and purchase via the link if you'd like to read along and think rationally.
Explore the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments and nourish your mind on the go. Consider this final thought.
If modern humanism eventually succeeds in extending human life indefinitely through science and medicine, will we still need philosophy at all? Or does a limitless physical life simply introduce an entirely new kind of existential dread?